This is the story of something that truly happened, something that still haunts the quiet town of Millersfield to this day. It began on a crisp autumn morning when an enormous shopping mall appeared out of nowhere. Just the day before, the land on the edge of town had been an abandoned lot, overgrown, filled with weeds, broken fences, and rumors of old construction plans that never happened. Locals had driven past that empty stretch for years without thinking twice, but overnight, as if summoned by magic or something darker, a fully built, shining mall stood proudly in its place. The building looked brand new, with glass panels that sparkled in the sun and a giant glowing sign that simply read, "The Grand Galleria." The whole town buzzed with questions. No one had seen any construction equipment. No one remembered seeing workers or even delivery trucks. And strangest of all, there had been no announcement, no news, no newspaper coverage, no grand opening commercial. It was just there. Naturally, people were curious. Some thought it was a government project. Others whispered about secret investors or even alien technology. The mystery pulled everyone in. By the weekend, families, teenagers, and elderly couples were pouring through the wide glass doors to see what was inside. Among them were 4 close friends, Michael, Jess, Ravi, and Tasha. They had grown up in Millersfield, and after hearing all the strange talk about the mall, they decided to explore it for themselves. As soon as they stepped inside, something felt wrong, though none of them said it out loud. The mall was clean, too clean. The air was filled with a strange scent, sweet and chemical, almost like a mix of cotton candy and antiseptic. The floors were spotless, the walls a perfect white, and the music that floated from unseen speakers sounded cheerful, yet oddly hollow. At first glance, everything looked normal. The stores were full of products: clothing, electronics, books, and toys. Food courts served hot meals, and escalators ran smoothly between floors. But something about the people working there was off. The store clerks all wore the same uniform, no matter what store they were in: gray slacks, white shirts, and plastic name tags. Their faces were friendly, but their smiles were wide and stiff, and their eyes didn't move like normal eyes. They blinked at the same time. They stared too long. They didn't react when people spoke unless the words were repeated twice. Michael noticed it first, nudging Jess when a cashier didn't even glance up as someone tried to ask a question. Instead, the worker just kept folding shirts, endlessly, as if they were trapped in a loop. Jess shrugged it off, trying to joke that maybe they were just tired or trained to act robotic. But Ravi wasn't convinced either. As they wandered deeper into the mall, the group began to notice that the layout didn't make sense. Stores that had been on the left were suddenly on the right. A hallway that once led to the food court now ended at a wall. The directory maps they tried to use changed each time they looked at them. Store names would switch places, and sometimes whole sections of the mall just vanished from the map. Tasha grew uneasy when they passed by a toy store for the 3rd time, even though they had been walking in a straight line. "We've already seen that weird clown in the window," she muttered, pulling Michael's sleeve. Inside the toy store window was a large clown doll, its painted smile too wide, its head tilted as if it was watching. Michael looked at it and felt a cold prickling crawl across his skin. That was when he realized that the clown had been facing a different direction. Before, the eyes were now turned toward them. The group pressed on, trying to shake the unease. Maybe the layout was just confusing. Maybe the employees were just trained to act strangely. But the deeper they went, the stranger things became. The air began to feel heavier, as if the ceiling were lowering. The lights overhead seemed slightly dimmer, and the music playing became distorted, like a record slowing down. Still, no one spoke about it directly. They were trying to act brave, not wanting to spook each other. They walked past a candy store, and for a moment, all 4 stopped at once. Behind the glass counter stood a man, or something that looked like a man, wearing a white apron. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. He stood motionless, holding a scoop of jelly beans, frozen mid-action like a paused video. They waited, expecting him to move, to blink, but he didn't. Jess whispered, "Is he real?" And Ravi stepped closer, raising his phone to snap a picture. At that exact moment, the figure's head snapped to look directly at him, and his mouth opened slightly. No words came out, just silence and the faint crackle of static. That was when Tasha said firmly, "Let's not go any further." But it was already too late. They didn't realize it then, but the mall was no longer just a building. It was watching. It had seen them, and now it wasn't going to let them leave easily. As the friends stood there, staring at the unnerving scene with the strange candy store worker, a chill ran through them. The stillness in the air felt suffocating now, the mall that had once seemed like a regular place growing more and more like a trap. Jess, ever the brave one, was the first to turn and walk away, but as her feet hit the floor, something happened that made her stop in her tracks. When she glanced over her shoulder, the candy store worker's face was gone. The glass counter was empty, the shelves stacked high with brightly colored jars and bins, but no sign of the man. His absence wasn't as unsettling as the way his uniform was still hanging behind the counter, as if he had just vanished into thin air. Michael, Ravi, and Tasha caught up with her, and they all shared a silent moment of disbelief. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. "Let's just head for the exit," Ravi muttered, trying to keep his voice steady, but it felt as though the mall was shifting around them. They turned down a nearby hallway, expecting to find a way out, only to be met with a wall that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The hallway that had once been there, leading to an open space, was now a dead end. The walls looked different, more polished than they had moments before. Tasha pressed her hand against the cold surface, feeling a strange vibration, as if the building itself was alive. They quickly turned and headed back the other way, only to find that the layout of the mall had changed again. The stores were no longer where they had been. They were in a different part of the building now, farther from where they'd started. Each hallway stretched out longer than it should have. Each store they passed looking familiar, but different, as if their memories of the mall were being erased and rewritten. There was no sign of any other shoppers or workers now. The lights above flickered more intensely, buzzing like faulty wiring, and the music was warping, a garbled tune that seemed to fade in and out. The four of them moved cautiously, realizing they were trapped in a maze that didn't make sense, but still, they pushed on. It wasn't until they reached a clothing store that things took a darker turn. The store looked ordinary at first, neatly. Arranged displays, racks of clothes and shoes lined up on shelves. But as they walked deeper into the store, a feeling of unease crept in. It wasn't just the silence that was unnerving, nor the fact that there were no customers. It was the mannequins. At first, there had been a few, standing stiffly at the back of the store, wearing the latest fashion. But as they walked past, Michael noticed something odd. One of the mannequins had moved, not dramatically, but subtly enough to make him pause. The mannequin that had been standing near a corner, perfectly still, was now positioned a few feet closer to the aisle. Its head was turned at an angle that wasn't natural, and its eyes, empty and hollow, seemed to follow them as they moved through the store. Michael blinked, unsure if he had imagined it, but as he turned to Jess, she noticed the same thing. "Did that one move?" she asked, her voice low and filled with disbelief. Before anyone could answer, Ravi spoke up, his voice shaky. "I saw another one. Over there," he said, pointing toward the back of the store, where another mannequin had inexplicably shifted its position, standing closer to the front now. They all froze, each one of them realizing at the same time that they weren't imagining it. The mannequins were slowly moving, not on their own, but as if someone, or something, was repositioning them while they weren't looking. Jess was the first to react, grabbing Tasha's hand and pulling her toward the back of the store. "We need to leave. Now," she said, her voice strained. But as they tried to make their way to the exit, they were met with something even more horrifying. The door, the one they had entered through, was no longer there. Instead, there was just a solid wall of white, smooth and unyielding, with no sign of the doorframe or the handle. They scrambled around the store, looking for another way out, but it felt as though the entire space was closing in on them. The mannequins, now too many to count, had moved closer, filling every corner of the store. Some were just standing there, their lifeless eyes locked on the group, while others were positioned as though they were watching them from the aisles, inching forward as the minutes passed. It was as if the store was slowly becoming a prison, the walls closing in, the air thickening. Panic set in, but there was no clear way to escape. Michael grabbed a mannequin's arm, trying to use it as leverage to pry open the wall where the door had once been, but the mannequin's body felt wrong. Too cold, too stiff, too unnatural. That was when they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to echo around the entire store. The group froze, eyes darting around. No one had entered the store. They hadn't heard the door open. The footsteps continued, but they didn't come from any direction that made sense. They came from behind the walls, behind the shelves, from all around them. Suddenly, it felt like the mall was alive, an entity that knew they were trapped and was toying with them. A noise came from the back corner of the store. A mannequin had fallen to the floor with a loud thud, as if it had been knocked over intentionally. They all looked toward the sound, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they turned, the mannequin that had fallen was gone, replaced by another figure. In its place, the shadowy figure seemed to be watching them, its head slightly tilted to one side, its hands folded in front of it like it was waiting. Without another word, they ran. They didn't care where they were going anymore. They just needed to get out. Each step took them deeper into the maze of the mall, but the terror didn't stop. The mannequins had moved closer, and the footsteps followed them relentlessly. It was no longer about finding the exit. It was about surviving long enough to escape whatever this place had become. But with each hallway they turned down, they found the walls closing in faster, the air growing colder, and the sound of footsteps growing louder. The mall was no longer a building, it was something far worse. And the worst part? They realized that the mall wasn't just changing around them. It had already begun to change them too. The panic was palpable, and no one could deny the truth of what was happening anymore. The mall was not just a strange building, it was something far more sinister. As the four friends ran down yet another hallway, the walls seemed to close in on them, as if the very structure of the mall was shifting around them. The once familiar corridors felt longer now, stretching endlessly in every direction. It was as if time had bent in this place, and the usual rules of reality no longer applied. Their breath came in shallow gasps as they ran, each step echoing in the eerie silence, except for the occasional unnatural sound of distant footsteps. But it wasn't just the footsteps that unnerved them. It was the silence that followed, as if something, or someone, was waiting just out of sight. There was a sudden sharp turn up ahead, and as they approached, they saw that the hallway was lined with large, darkened windows. Through the glass, they could make out vague shapes, twisted and contorted, but the strange reflections didn't make sense. They should have been looking into another part of the mall, yet the windows showed a desolate landscape. Dead trees, a dark sky, and a cold, barren ground stretching out as far as the eye could see. The world outside looked wrong. It was like a nightmare, a place that couldn't exist. Yet there it was. Jess stopped for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared at the landscape beyond the glass. It was so cold, so lifeless that a chill crawled up her spine. She turned to the others, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't real. None of this is real." But there was no time to question it. They couldn't stop running now. Not when they knew the mall was hunting them, and they had no idea where they were going. They reached the end of the hallway and found another store. The sign above read, "The Abyssal Bookstore." But there was something unsettling about it. The windows were blacked out, the shelves empty, and the door, when they pushed it open, creaked. Loudly, its hinges groaning like a warning. Michael stepped inside first, cautiously, with the others following closely behind. As soon as they entered, the door slammed shut behind them, and the temperature dropped instantly. They could see their breath in the air, the coldness biting through their clothes. The bookstore was dark, but the strange thing was that they couldn't tell where the darkness came from. There were no lights to dim, no shadows cast by overhead lamps, just pure, thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow everything around them. Tasha fumbled in her bag for her phone, hoping to use the flashlight, but it was dead. The battery had drained completely in the few minutes they'd been running. Panic surged through them all as they realized they were not just stuck in the dark, they were stuck in this nightmarish place with no way to see what was coming. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper filled the air. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too clear. It was a voice, but not one they recognized. The voice whispered words in a language none of them could understand, but it sounded ancient, as though it belonged to a time long forgotten. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up. Then, the whisper stopped, and the silence was deafening. The air seemed to tighten around them, and they could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. Michael turned to the others, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here. This place is wrong." But as they moved toward the door, something shifted in the darkness. A shape appeared before them, a figure just barely visible in the gloom. At first it seemed like another mannequin, standing motionless, its face hidden in shadow. But as they drew closer, they saw the truth. The figure wasn't still. It was breathing. The ragged, shallow breaths echoed in the silence, and as it moved slightly, they could make out the shape of a person, alive, but twisted, grotesque. Its eyes were empty voids, and its mouth stretched wide in a horrible grin, revealing rows of teeth too sharp to belong to any human. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching them, its grin widening with each passing second. Ravi took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. No one answered. Instead, they turned and ran, not caring which direction they went, only wanting to escape the nightmare that had taken hold of them all. The darkness seemed to follow them, pressing against their backs, until they found themselves outside the bookstore. But even as they emerged, they realized something worse. The hallway had changed again. The corridor they had entered through was no longer there. They were standing in a large open space now, surrounded by walls that stretched high into the air, too tall for them to see the top. There were no windows here, no doors, only cold, smooth walls that seemed to pulse and breathe like a living thing. The air felt thick and oppressive, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with an energy they couldn't comprehend. It was as though the entire mall had turned into a living organism, its veins and arteries stretching out in every direction, drawing them deeper into its heart. They didn't know how much time had passed since they'd entered the mall, but it felt like hours, maybe days. The concept of time seemed to lose all meaning. Michael, Jess, Ravi, and Tasha huddled together, the fear tightening around them. There was no way out, no exit, no way to escape. The mall had them trapped, and whatever was inside was no longer pretending to be just a building. It was alive. As they stood in that space, the walls shifted again, this time opening into a new passage. The passage was dark, deeper than the others they had seen, and it seemed to stretch out into infinity. They didn't know if they should follow the path or stay in the open, but as the silence grew unbearable, they realized that staying still wasn't an option. The mall was not going to let them escape easily. Whatever twisted force had brought them here was not finished with them yet. In that moment, they understood with horrifying clarity. The mall was alive, and it had its own plans for them. Their only choice was to keep moving, deeper into the maze, hoping that somewhere, anywhere, there would be an end to this nightmare. But deep down, they feared that the mall had no end. They were never going to leave. The darkness had become their enemy, thick and suffocating, a presence that weighed heavily on their shoulders. Every corner of the mall now seemed to shift, to warp in ways that defied logic. The group of friends stumbled down the passage, their footsteps echoing, but even that sound seemed muted by the thick air around them. The coldness was unbearable, and yet the walls, which seemed alive, pulsed with an unsettling warmth, as though something or someone was watching them, studying their every move. It was no longer just the mall they were trapped in. It was the fear that had begun to consume them, creeping into their thoughts, eroding the line between what was real and what was imagined. They had no way of knowing how far they'd traveled, or even how much time had passed. The walls around them looked the same, endless and gray, the lighting dim, with flickering bulbs casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. No matter how fast they ran, no matter how many turns they took, nothing looked familiar. No signs, no storefronts, no windows, just the never-ending maze that had swallowed them whole. Their phones were dead, the batteries drained without warning. The world outside, if it even existed anymore, was as unreachable as the sun itself. Desperation had begun to sink into their hearts. Michael, once so strong and confident, now walked with his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting around nervously. Jess clutched her arms around her, trying to hold on to the tiny thread of hope that had kept her going, but even that was beginning to unravel. Tasha's face was pale, her lips trembling, and Ravi kept looking over his shoulder, certain that something was just behind them, ready to pounce. The whispers hadn't stopped either. They were everywhere, a low murmur, an undercurrent of voices that spoke in tongues they couldn't understand. At first it was just a faint sound, like the wind in the trees, but now it was growing louder, clearer, as if something was trying to communicate with them, but the words were impossible to grasp. Each step forward felt like a step deeper into some hellish dream they couldn't wake from. The friends began to question everything. How had they ended up in the mall in the first place? Was this a nightmare? Were they asleep? No answer seemed possible, but the longer they stayed here, the more certain they became that nothing made sense anymore. The further they walked, the more the mall seemed to twist around them, reshaping itself in a grotesque reflection of what it once was. They passed another storefront, but this one wasn't like the others. Its door was slightly ajar, and the dim light inside seemed to flicker erratically. Without thinking, Jess pushed the door open, a quick decision born from desperation. The inside of the shop was nothing like the rest of the mall. The walls were covered with strange symbols, painted in what looked like blood. The floor was a cracked, uneven stone, and a strange, sweet smell hung in the air, souring their stomachs. At the back of the store was a large, darkened mirror. But it wasn't just any mirror. The glass was cracked, pieces missing, and the reflection it gave back wasn't their own. For a split second, Jess could have sworn she saw a figure standing behind them in the mirror, just out of the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, her heart racing, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched intensified, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. "We shouldn't be here," Ravi whispered, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. But before anyone could respond, the mirror seemed to warp. The reflection of the store began to distort, the symbols on the walls twisting and reshaping into new forms. The air in the room thickened, and the temperature dropped even further. There was no warmth now, only the chill of an otherworldly presence. And then, without warning, the glass in the mirror shattered. The pieces didn't fall. They simply vanished, swallowed by the blackness that seemed to have erupted from within the mirror. A deep, unnatural growl resonated from the void, vibrating through the very walls. It felt like the mall itself was screaming, and the sound was deafening. The friends froze, unable to move, their legs rooted to the floor by a terror so deep that it paralyzed their every instinct. A shadow rose from the mirror's broken frame, towering over them, its shape monstrous and incomprehensible. It seemed to shift and melt, stretching out like dark smoke, but with a presence so solid, so terrifying, that they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It wasn't a human figure, not even close. It was something far worse, a creature born of pure darkness, its body writhing and twisting, a nightmare made flesh. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and the temperature plummeted, sending violent shivers through their spines. The creature's eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and its mouth opened wide in a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed to gleam with hunger. There was no sound as it stepped forward, its body undulating like liquid, the shadows folding around it like a cloak. Its eyes locked onto Jess, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a speed that couldn't be followed, the creature lunged toward her. But as it moved, the others snapped into action, rushing forward to pull her out of the way. They didn't know how they did it, how they managed to fight back the darkness, but somehow, Jess was pulled free, and the creature missed. The instant the creature missed, a pulse of dark energy exploded from it, throwing them all backward, slamming them against the walls of the shop. Jess's head hit the wall hard, and for a moment, everything went black. When she came to, the others were shaking her, and the creature was gone. But the damage had been done. The walls of the store were now cracked open, revealing an endless abyss behind them, a chasm that seemed to stretch into eternity. The friends didn't need any more encouragement. They didn't care which way they ran. All they knew was that the mall was trying to kill them, and they had to escape. Now, before whatever that thing was came back. They bolted from the shop, fear driving them faster than any of them had run before. But no matter how fast they ran, the feeling that something was closing in on them never went away. It followed them, a constant chilling presence, as though the mall itself had become a living thing, hungry and relentless. The hallways twisted around them, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The walls themselves seemed to stretch and shift, pulling them deeper into the nightmare. They didn't know where they were going, but they kept running, hoping that somehow, some way, they would find an exit, a way out of this endless labyrinth of terror. But the mall had other plans. And it wasn't done with them yet.